My SIL criticized my wedding dress as the worst she has seen, but my brother's speech uncovered her plan to sabotage my wedding. From the moment my sister-in-law Brooke laid eyes on my wedding dress, she treated it like a personal offense she could not forgive or forget. During my fitting, she leaned back in her chair and laughed under her breath before launching into a running commentary about how the neckline screamed attention seeking and how the lace reminded her of something she once saw hanging in a dusty window. She said it made me look desperate and outdated and warned me that I would regret choosing something so old-fashioned. I stood there listening with my hands clenched together, trying to stay calm, because this dress mattered more to me than she could ever understand. It was my grandmother Ruth's gown from 1952, carefully restored and altered to fit me. Every stitch carried family history and love, but Brooke acted like I had pulled it from a trash pile. After that fitting, she began sending me links daily to sleek modern dresses with messages suggesting they would hide my arms or balance my body better. When I told her I was happy, she sighed dramatically and said some people just do not want to look their best on their wedding day. Every word felt like a tiny cut, but I stayed quiet and focused on what the dress meant to me. The criticism followed me everywhere. At my bridal shower, Brooke made a show of telling a room full of guests that she had tried to help me find something more flattering, but I was too stubborn to listen. She even announced that she had offered to pay for a better dress, but I insisted on wearing that old thing. My mother Karen sat there furious but silent, choosing peace over confrontation. At my bachelorette party, Brooke showed up with fabric samples and talked about rush shipping something decent, while strangers at the bar listened to her complain that I would cry when I saw my photos. It felt like she was on a mission to embarrass me into changing my mind. The week before, the wedding vendors started calling me confused because Brooke had contacted them suggesting they adjust everything from photography angles to makeup contouring to bouquet size to distract from my dress. Each call made my stomach tighten, but I kept telling myself there was a reason. I was staying calm, and that reason was bigger than her. The night of the rehearsal dinner, Brooke arrived with a garment bag and announced she had brought a backup dress in case I came to my senses. Inside was a tight sequined thing she claimed was what modern brides wore, and she said my dress made me look like I was pretending to be my grandmother. My husband-to-be, Alex, finally told her to stop, but she brushed him off, saying she was trying to save me from myself. The morning of the wedding, she hovered while I got ready, commenting on the lighting, showing the yellow in the fabric, and how my arms looked uncovered. My bridesmaids, Rachel among them, were ready to escort her out, but I asked them to let it go. I had my reasons for staying steady. When I walked down the aisle, I heard Brooke whisper that I looked like I was wearing a community theater costume, but the rest of the room was crying at how beautiful the dress was. Ruth sat in her wheelchair sobbing with joy, seeing her dress again, and that alone made every cruel word worth enduring. After the ceremony, Brooke did not let up. During cocktail hour, she cornered relatives, pointing out the uneven hem, the dulled beading, and how the silhouette was wrong for my body. She did not know my cousin Lily was recording speeches for Ruth and happened to capture everything. Brooke had been married to my brother, Daniel, for 8 years and never missed a chance to remind anyone that her own wedding had been a massive expensive affair, complete with a designer dress she talked about constantly. She loved to say that was a real wedding dress. As the reception began, the energy felt tight, like everyone was bracing for something. Daniel stood up to give his toast, and instead of focusing on Alex and me, he began talking about what seeing his sister in our grandmother's dress had made him realize. The room went silent, and Brooke smiled, thinking he was finally about to validate her opinions. Daniel spoke about how the dress represented family history and love, and how Ruth and our grandfather had shared 67 years together built on respect rather than show. He turned and looked directly at Brooke, and said his wife had obsessed over appearances and price tags at their own wedding, and that her $20,000 dress sat unused in a closet while my dress carried generations of meaning. Brooke's smile froze, and the room felt like it stopped breathing. Daniel then said that since she cared so much about appearances, everyone should know people had been talking about her outfit today. She was wearing a white-laced cocktail dress to my wedding. The silence was heavy, and I could hear my own heartbeat. Daniel revealed screenshots and recordings Lily had taken of Brooke criticizing my dress to relatives, and suddenly her own voice filled the hall, calling my dress a yellowed rag and mocking my taste. Gasps rippled through the room as heads turned and whispers spread. Brooke tried to stand and defend herself, saying she was only trying to help, but her voice cracked and shook. Daniel calmly told her to sit down and let everyone hear what she had been saying for months. Her face flushed red, then pale, as realization set in. My mother covered her mouth in shock, and the photographer nodded, confirming Brooke had tried to interfere with the wedding. Rachel squeezed my hand, while Alex held the other, grounding me as the truth unfolded. When Brooke finally sat, her hands trembled on the table, and her confidence drained away. The atmosphere shifted from celebration to reckoning, and it felt like something long buried had been dragged into the light. Ruth wheeled herself forward, and the room went quiet again. She spoke clearly about how the dress Brooke criticized was the one she wore marrying the love of her life, and how they had shared decades together. She looked at Brooke and asked how long a marriage could last without respect. The words hung heavy, and Brooke's composure collapsed. She grabbed her purse and ordered Daniel to leave with her, but he stayed where he was. Instead, he knelt beside Ruth, apologizing for not speaking up sooner. She patted his hand and whispered something that made his shoulders relax. Brooke stood alone, scanning the room, realizing no one was following her. When Daniel did not move, she stormed out, and the door closed behind her, leaving a stunned quiet in its wake. The DJ finally played music, and the room slowly came back to life. Guests began dancing and offering hugs and compliments about the dress and its history. Ruth was surrounded by friends admiring the beadwork she had sewn by hand and sharing stories of marriages built on substance. My niece Olivia approached me quietly and apologized for her mother's behavior, telling me I looked beautiful, and her kindness nearly brought me to tears. Alex pulled me onto the dance floor for our first dance. And as we swayed, he whispered that my brother's speech had been incredible. As the skirt flowed around us and the beating caught the light, I realized this day had become more than a wedding. It was about standing up for what mattered and choosing meaning over show. The music carried us forward, and I knew this was only the beginning of what the truth had set in motion. As the music filled the hall and guests slowly returned to their conversations, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The confrontation had cracked something open, and now warmth rushed in to fill the space it left behind. Relatives I had not spoken to all evening came over one by one to touch the lace on my sleeve and tell me how stunning the dress was and how much the story behind it moved them. Some admitted quietly that Brooke's comments had bothered them for months, but they did not know how to step in. Hearing that made me realize how many people had been holding their tongues just to keep the peace. Alex stayed close with his arm around my waist, grounding me as everything shifted from shock to support. Daniel re-entered the reception a few minutes after Brooke left, and though he looked exhausted, there was a lightness about him, like someone who had finally set down a heavy burden. Guests patted his shoulder as he passed, and he nodded with a small, tired smile. Olivia stayed near him, looking relieved and proud all at once. When he reached our table, he apologized again for making a scene at our wedding, but I told him honestly that his words made me feel supported in a way I had not felt all year. All the months of quiet criticism had chipped away at me more than I admitted, and hearing him speak the truth out loud healed something deep inside my chest. Lily found me near the dance floor later, holding her phone with a look that was half nervous, half satisfied. She pulled me aside and showed me a long list of audio files dated over the past 6 months. She explained that after the bridal shower, Daniel had asked her to document every comment Brooke made about my dress, and she had recorded dozens of moments from family dinners and holidays. The clip played during the speech was only a small part of what she had collected. I stared at the screen, stunned, realizing my brother had been preparing to confront this for a long time. Lily offered to send me the recordings, but I shook my head, telling her the truth was already out and I did not need to hear more. As the night went on, the mood lifted further and laughter replaced the earlier tension. My aunt pulled me into a hug, whispering that she wished she had spoken up sooner, and another cousin admitted she had always felt Brooke cared more about appearances than people. Ruth sat surrounded by her friends, proudly explaining the beadwork and how she sewed it by hand after dinner every night for 3 months. Watching her glow with pride made my heart feel full. This was why I stayed calm through everything, because I knew the meaning would eventually speak louder than the cruelty. Near the exit, I noticed Daniel standing with Brooke just outside the hall. Even from across the room, I could see her gesturing wildly while he stood with his arms crossed, listening but not reacting. She pointed back toward the reception, then at herself, like she was pleading her case. Every few seconds, she paused, waiting for him to agree, but he remained still. When she grabbed his arm, he gently pulled away and shook his head. Something shifted in her posture then, and panic flashed across her face. Daniel said a few quiet words, and Brooke froze, staring at him like she could not believe what she heard. Then she turned and walked out alone, leaving him standing there taking a long, steady breath. When Daniel returned inside, he looked lighter but also sad, and I realized that whatever he said to Brooke marked a turning point neither of them could undo. The DJ sensed the room had changed and played faster music, and soon the dance floor filled with movement and laughter. Alex spun me, and the skirt of the dress flowed just as I imagined, catching the lights in tiny sparkles. My mother Karen danced with my father nearby, wiping tears from her cheeks and smiling at me with pride. Daniel danced with Olivia, who looked up at him with relief and joy. The night no longer felt heavy, but honest. Later, as I stepped off the dance floor to cool down, Lily approached again, looking conflicted. She told me family members were already texting her, asking for copies of the recordings, wanting to know exactly what Brooke said at different gatherings. The idea of those files spreading made my stomach twist, so I told Lily firmly to delete everything. She nodded, relieved, and deleted them right there. I did not want to fuel more drama because the point had been made publicly and clearly. Brooke's behavior no longer needed proof. It was already understood. Karen found me near the cake table, her eyes red from crying, and she pulled me into a tight hug. She apologized for staying silent at the bridal shower and bachelorette party, saying she had been trying to avoid conflict but realized that silence only enabled cruelty. I told her I understood and that I was not angry because everything had unfolded the way it needed to. She touched the lace on my shoulder and said I looked exactly like Ruth did in old photos, confident and completely myself. Hearing that felt like a blessing. Daniel joined Alex and me as we waited for the photographer to set up cake-cutting photos. He looked nervous and admitted he had been planning the speech for weeks, afraid of what it would mean for his marriage but unable to keep pretending everything was fine. He said seeing Brooke wear white to my wedding had been the final straw. Alex put a hand on his shoulder, telling him there was nothing to apologize for and that standing up for family mattered. Daniel exhaled like he had been holding his breath for months. As the reception wound down, Ruth waved me over and asked me to show her friends the beadwork again. I leaned closer and let them examine the tiny flowers and vines sewn into the bodice. They murmured in appreciation, sharing stories of their own handmade dresses and long marriages built on patience and respect. Standing there, surrounded by these women, made me feel connected to something larger than myself, like I was carrying forward a legacy rather than just wearing a gown. Olivia approached again, asking shyly if she could take a photo with me because she wanted to remember how the dress really looked. We posed together smiling, and afterward she confided that her mom had been stressed about money and jealous that I had a meaningful wedding without debt. Hearing that added context that softened my anger, though it did not excuse the behavior. It made Brooke seem less like a villain and more like someone projecting her regrets onto me. When Alex and I finally left for our hotel that night, exhaustion hit us all at once, and we collapsed onto the bed still in our wedding clothes, staring at the ceiling. Alex laughed softly, saying it was the most dramatic wedding he had ever attended but also the most real. I realized he was right because instead of a perfect facade, we began our marriage with honesty and truth. That felt like a stronger foundation than any flawless celebration. The next morning, my phone buzzed endlessly with messages from family members sharing support and opinions. Some praised Daniel for finally speaking up, while others thought airing marital problems publicly was wrong. The divide showed how differently people valued honesty versus discretion. Karen called, telling me Brooke had shown up at her house early demanding Daniel apologized, and Karen had stood her ground, saying she could not control a grown man. The call left Karen drained but resolute, and I reassured her that despite the chaos, I felt strangely free. Daniel texted apologizing again, and when I called him, we talked for over an hour about his fears and concerns, especially for Olivia. He admitted he had been unhappy for years but stayed because leaving felt like failure. Watching me stand firm about the dress helped him see how much he had compromised his own values to keep peace. I listened, offering support and telling him I was proud of his courage, even though the road ahead would be hard. 3 days later, Brooke called me, accusing me of destroying her marriage and turning her daughter against her. Anger flared, but I kept my voice steady, telling her her behavior was only a symptom of deeper issues and that the dress was not stupid but priceless to me. She hung up abruptly, and I stood there, shaking until Alex wrapped his arms around me, reminding me that Daniel made his own choices. Even knowing that guilt lingered as we prepared to leave for our honeymoon, unsure how to step away while family upheaval continued. The thought of leaving for our honeymoon, while everything felt unsettled, weighed on me heavily, and I found myself pacing our kitchen, twisting my ring around my finger as Alex unpacked groceries. Part of me felt selfish for wanting to escape when Daniel was facing the collapse of his marriage and Olivia was caught in the middle. But another part knew I could not fix problems that existed long before my wedding. Alex sat me down and reminded me gently that my brother was an adult, making his own choices, and that starting our marriage by putting ourselves last would not help anyone. His calm certainty steadied me even as guilt lingered like a dull ache. Before we left, Ruth called asking if I could come by because she wanted to show me something. Her voice carried a seriousness that made me go immediately. When I arrived, her living room was filled with old photo albums spread across the table, and sunlight filtered through lace curtains casting soft patterns across the floor. She opened one album to a photo of her and my grandfather on their 50th anniversary, smiling at each other like they shared a secret. She traced the image and spoke about how happiness came from choosing each other every day, even when it was hard. She told me long marriages were not built on perfection but on shared values and respect. Then she looked at me and said the dress situation was never about fabric but about someone refusing to respect what mattered to me. Hearing that eased something inside my chest. I admitted my fear that the kids were suffering because of what happened at my wedding, but Ruth shook her head firmly and said those cracks existed long before, and it was better they saw truth than years of pretending. We sat together for hours as she shared stories of disagreements she and my grandfather faced over money and family, and how they navigated them with mutual respect. When I left her house, I felt lighter and more resolved to stop carrying responsibility that was never mine. Our honeymoon passed in a blur of ocean air and quiet mornings, and though family messages still came through, they no longer consumed me the way they had before. Distance gave perspective, and I realized how important it was to protect the peace Alex and I were building. When we returned, Daniel invited us to dinner at his new apartment, and I was struck by how simple the space was and how relaxed he seemed, sitting on the floor eating takeout. He talked openly about how exhausting it had been living for appearances, and how freeing it felt to stop performing for an invisible audience. Olivia and her younger brother adjusted better than expected and even seemed excited by the change. Seeing Daniel lighter confirmed that speaking the truth, though painful, had been necessary. A week later, Olivia asked to meet me for coffee and spoke with a maturity that surprised me. She told me watching her parents fight about money and status made her think deeply about what she wanted in her own future, and she did not want to live always comparing and criticizing. I made sure to acknowledge Brooke's strengths to explaining that drive and organization could be good qualities when not used to control others. Olivia listened thoughtfully and admitted the good memories were harder to see when criticism grew loud. By the time we parted, she seemed less burdened, and I felt grateful she trusted me enough to talk. Family dinners resumed slowly, with new boundaries and a quieter honesty. Karen hosted one evening focused on keeping things calm for the kids, and when Olivia's brother asked directly if I was mad at his mom, I answered carefully, saying adults sometimes disagreed, and that nothing changed how much we loved him. The simplicity of his acceptance reminded me how children often handle truth better than adults. Afterward, Daniel thanked me privately for not fueling resentment, and I realized how important neutrality was for the kids' well-being. Married life settled into routines, and the wedding drama began to feel like a chapter rather than the whole story. Alex and I talked about future plans and framed a wedding photo where Ruth's dress shimmered softly, reminding me daily why standing firm mattered. 6 weeks later, Daniel called to tell me he had officially filed for divorce after counseling failed because Brooke could not accept responsibility for her behavior. His voice was sad but steady, and I could hear resolve beneath the grief. The next day, I received a long email from Brooke filled with blame and justification, and only the faintest hint of acknowledgement. After reading it with Alex, we decided silence was the healthiest response, and I let it go. Not long after that, Karen called early one morning to say Ruth had fallen and was in the hospital. Fear rushed through me as I drove there, gripping the wheel too tightly. Ruth waved off concern, annoyed by the fuss, but seeing her frail in a hospital bed made me confront how precious time was. I thanked her again for the dress and the wisdom she passed down, and she smiled, saying the gown had lived a long life and was still doing its work. The thought of it carrying stories across generations moved me deeply. Months passed and Daniel slowly rebuilt his life, meeting someone kind and grounded who valued substance over image. Family gatherings felt different but more honest, and Courtney's presence became quieter and less volatile. One afternoon Olivia surprised me by asking if she could borrow Ruth's dress for her prom, altered into a modern style while keeping its essence. When Ruth saw the sketches, her eyes lit up and she eagerly planned the alterations, excited to see the dress evolve again. Watching that enthusiasm reminded me how meaning could adapt without being lost. By spring, a family barbecue brought everyone together with manageable tension and genuine conversation. Brooke stayed mostly to one side but behaved civilly, and when Olivia laughed with both parents nearby, I felt hope that healing was possible even if imperfect. Alex stood beside me, arm around my waist, and I leaned into him, grateful for the journey we were on together. The dress rested safely preserved, waiting for its next chapter, and I realized it had done more than clothe me on my wedding day. It had exposed truths, forced growth, and ultimately strengthened the family by demanding honesty over illusion. Life continued to move forward in quiet, steady ways, and the intensity that once surrounded my wedding slowly softened into something reflective rather than raw. Alex and I found our rhythm as a married couple, learning how to balance work, family, and our own space. The house search became a shared project filled with weekend showings and conversations about what we wanted our future to look like. Every now and then something small, like seeing Ruth's dress preservation box tucked safely in the closet, would remind me of everything it had stirred up. But instead of tension, I felt gratitude for how much clarity it brought. Daniel settled further into his new routine and invited us over more often. His apartment filled gradually with borrowed furniture and small personal touches that reflected who he actually was rather than what he thought others expected him to be. He talked openly about therapy and about unlearning years of measuring worth through appearances. It was strange and comforting to see my older brother vulnerable and honest in a way he had never allowed himself to be before. Olivia seemed to thrive with the shift and carried herself with more confidence now that the constant pressure had eased. Karen confided one afternoon that she felt both relief and regret. Relief that the tension in the family was finally acknowledged, and regret that she had stayed quiet for so long. She said watching everything unfold forced her to confront how often silence was mistaken for peace. Her words stayed with me and made me realize how generational those patterns could be, and how easily they passed down unless someone disrupted them. I felt proud in a quiet way that standing firm about a dress had challenged something deeper than fashion. A few weeks later, Daniel called to tell me he had been seeing someone seriously. Her name was Emily, and she worked as an elementary school teacher near his apartment. He described her as grounded, warm, and uninterested in status. When I met her at a small family dinner, she arrived in jeans and a sweater, carrying a homemade dessert, and immediately sat with Ruth, asking about the dress and listening intently to every detail. The ease with which she connected to the family made it obvious how different this chapter was for Daniel. Alex whispered to me later that he had never seen my brother look so relaxed. As summer approached, family gatherings became more frequent and less strained. Courtney attended but stayed reserved, keeping conversations polite and surface level. The sharp edge that once defined her presence dulled into something more controlled. I did not trust it completely, but I appreciated the effort for the sake of the kids. Olivia spent more time with me and Ruth, asking questions about the dress and family history. She seemed hungry for meaning beyond what she grew up with, and I was careful to encourage that curiosity without turning it into judgment against her mother. One afternoon, Olivia came over with a sketchbook full of ideas for her prom dress adaptation. Ruth sat beside her, animated and joyful, debating bead placement and fabric cuts. Watching the two of them collaborate bridged something beautiful between generations and healed a piece of the past I did not even realize was fractured. Ruth's laughter filled the room, and for a moment, time felt circular rather than linear. Not everything resolved neatly, of course. Courtney and Daniel navigated custody arrangements with moments of tension and moments of cooperation. Some family members still whispered opinions about how everything unfolded and whether it should have been handled privately. But those voices grew quieter as time passed, and new routines replaced old habits. I learned that not everyone needed to agree for healing to happen. Alex and I hosted Thanksgiving that year, squeezing tables together and borrowing chairs. The apartment was loud and warm and imperfect. Karen gave a toast about respecting each other's values and learning when to speak and when to listen. I felt a swell of emotion knowing how far we had come in such a short time. The family looked different, but it felt more honest, and that mattered more than symmetry. When the wedding photos finally arrived, I spent hours looking through them, seeing details I missed in the moment. The dress glowed softly, and Ruth's face shone with pride in every frame we shared. I created a special album just for her, and when I gave it to her, she cried quietly, turning each page and telling stories I had never heard. About sewing by lamplight and walking down the aisle on her brother's arm. Those stories layered new meaning onto memories I already cherished. As winter approached, Courtney reached out through Daniel, asking if I would meet her for coffee. The request stirred a mix of hesitation and curiosity. After days of consideration and encouragement from Alex, I agreed with clear boundaries. We met in a busy cafe, and she looked smaller than I remembered, tired, and stripped of the polished confidence she once wore like armor. She spoke about therapy and about realizing how much of her identity was tied to that expensive wedding and the image she built around it. She admitted, seeing me choose meaning over money forced her to confront regrets she had buried for years. It was not a full apology, and she did not acknowledge every specific hurt, but it was the first time she spoke without defensiveness. I listened without interrupting, and then told her calmly that while I appreciated her honesty, we would never be close, and that civility for the kids was all I hoped for. She nodded, quickly relieved, and we parted without warmth or hostility, just a quiet understanding. It felt realistic, and that was enough. 6 months after the wedding, Alex and I stood in another house tour, barely listening to the realtor as I reflected on how much had changed. My marriage felt solid, rooted in shared values and respect rather than performance. Daniel looked healthier and happier than he had in years, and the kids adjusted to a new normal that felt less tense. Courtney remained part of the family but no longer dominated it. Boundaries replaced pretense. One evening Olivia called asking if we could meet, and when we sat together she nervously asked if she could borrow Ruth's dress for her junior prom, keeping its structure but modernizing it slightly. The request caught me off guard and moved me deeply. When I brought the idea to Ruth she beamed immediately and began planning alterations with excitement. Seeing the dress continue its journey through the family felt symbolic of growth rather than loss. At a spring barbecue everyone gathered in the yard with cautious ease. Courtney stayed mostly to one side but smiled genuinely when Olivia showed her a project. Daniel laughed freely with Emily and the kids played without tension. Ruth sat in her lawn chair telling stories to anyone who would listen. Alex stood beside me, arm around my waist, and I leaned into him feeling grounded and grateful. The dress rested safely in its box, waiting for its next transformation, but the impact it had already made lingered everywhere. It had challenged, silenced, exposed fractures, and ultimately pushed our family toward a more honest version of itself. Standing there surrounded by imperfect but real connections, I understood that meaning was not something you preserved by avoiding conflict, but by facing it with integrity, and that lesson would stay with me far longer than any wedding memory. The months that followed settled into a quieter rhythm, and the story of the wedding slowly transformed from something raw into something reflective. Alex and I focused on building our life together, choosing routines that felt intentional rather than reactive. Mornings became about shared coffee and planning evenings rather than checking phones for family updates. In that calm, I finally understood how much energy I had spent bracing for conflict and how freeing it was to let that guard down. The echoes of that day still existed, but they no longer controlled the present. Ruth remained the center of gravity for all of us, and I made it a point to visit her regularly, sometimes to help around the house and sometimes just to sit and listen. She loved talking about the dress and how amused she was that something sewn so long ago still had the power to stir people so deeply. She said objects carried the intentions of the hands that made them and the choices of the people who wore them. Hearing that reframed everything for me and turned the dress into something alive rather than preserved. Daniel continued moving forward with steady resolve, and though divorce was never easy, he handled it with patience and care for the kids. Emily became a quiet constant in his life and never tried to replace anyone or perform a role. She simply showed up consistently, and that consistency did more to heal the kids than any grand gesture ever could. Olivia grew closer to Ruth, asking her questions about family history and values, and it felt like watching a bridge form where a gap once existed. Courtney remained on the periphery, respectful but distant, and while some part of me hoped for a fuller apology, I learned to accept the version of peace that was available. It was not reconciliation or forgiveness, but it was functional and safe for the kids. And that mattered more than my need for closure. Therapy seemed to be changing her in small, uneven ways, and I chose to acknowledge progress without reopening wounds. When prom season approached, Ruth and Olivia spent entire afternoons planning alterations for the dress. They laughed, debated, and sketched like co-conspirators, and the joy on Ruth's face made every hard moment leading up to this worthwhile. The dress would be shortened, reshaped, and accented, but the beadwork would remain intact, a thread connecting past and future. Watching that collaboration felt like watching healing happen in real time. The night of the prom, Olivia stood in the living room transformed and radiant, and Ruth cried openly, seeing her handiwork evolve again. Courtney watched quietly from the doorway, and for once said nothing critical. She simply nodded and told her daughter she looked beautiful. That moment did not erase the past, but it marked something important, a pause in the pattern, and I held on to that. Alex and I finally found a house that felt right, modest, comfortable, and filled with light. Moving in felt symbolic of everything we had learned about choosing substance over spectacle. The first framed photo we hung was from the wedding, not because it was perfect, but because it represented honesty and resolve. Ruth's dress shimmered softly in the image, and it felt like a blessing watching over the space. Family gatherings grew easier over time, and the tension that once dominated the room softened into awareness and boundaries. People spoke more directly and listened more carefully. Silence was no longer the default response to discomfort, and that shift alone changed everything. Karen often remarked how different holidays felt now and how much lighter they were without the pressure to pretend. One afternoon, Ruth asked me to bring the wedding album again, and as we flipped through the pages, she paused on a photo of the dance floor where everyone looked mid-motion, unguarded, and real. She said that was what marriage looked like, movement, adjustment, and shared direction, not stillness or perfection. Her words stayed with me long after I left and became something I carried into my own marriage. As the year turned, Alex and I found ourselves mentoring friends, quietly sharing lessons learned about boundaries and values. I realized that the story of the dress had grown beyond our family and become something others connected to, not because of drama but because it illustrated what happened when meaning was prioritized over appearance. That realization felt humbling and grounding at the same time. Daniel eventually thanked me again, saying that if I had folded under pressure he might have stayed silent forever. Hearing that reaffirmed something deep inside me, that standing firm, even quietly, had power beyond what could be seen in the moment. It did not require confrontation or volume, it required clarity. On the anniversary of the wedding, Alex and I visited Ruth, together bringing her flowers and sitting in the same living room where the albums once lay scattered. She squeezed our hands and told us she was proud of how we handled everything with grace and strength. She said love was not about avoiding conflict but about facing it without losing yourself. Those words felt like a final gift, wrapping the entire journey into something complete. That evening, Alex and I returned home and stood together looking at the photo on the wall. The dress, the smiles, the movement frozen in time yet full of life. I realized then that the dress had never been the worst gown anyone had ever seen. It was simply the most honest, and honesty often made people uncomfortable. Choosing it had changed everything, not because it was old or beautiful, but because it demanded respect for what truly mattered. As I turned off the lights and leaned into Alex, I felt grateful, not just for the resolution but for the disruption that led to it. The story did not end with perfection or applause, but with understanding and growth, and that felt far more meaningful than any flawless ending could have been.